Hello, AP US History class. This is Mr. Shalou. We are moving on with World War II material. This is the longest section. I will try my best to be brief, but looking at World War II, America's participation, this is really going to get into the nuts and bolts of America fighting two wars at the same time. This is not a situation like World War One where we could put all of our resources on the Western Front to push back against Germany. We're talking about two completely different wars on two halves of the globe, and we had to come up with a plan. So, just before we get to that, Germany was really successful in the first years of this war. By the time America joins in, it's not looking good. If you take a look at that map, it pretty much shows how Germany had dominated pretty much all of the European continent, with the exception of like Sweden, Great Britain, Spain, who was neutral. And you could see that the invasion of the Soviet Union had already taken place at this point. So that's it. Everyone is conquered in Europe. And then you have Switzerland being a neutral country right there in the middle. But for much of 1942, America had no opportunities to actually attack Germany on the European continent. They had no way of breaking the blockade into mainland Europe. So it's not looking great for the Allies in 1942. German armies were closing in on Moscow in the Soviet Union. It was a 900-day siege at Leningrad that is going to be really one of the turning points in the war. Over 1 million civilian Russians are going to die, in addition to the 1.5 million people that are going to die on the campaign here in Leningrad and Moscow and Stalingrad. At the same time, it's not looking great in the Pacific either. After Pearl Harbor, Japan is going to consolidate its power in the Pacific by knocking out Guam, Wake Island, Hong Kong, Singapore. Douglas MacArthur, who had control of the Philippines, had to give up control of the Philippines. So it's not great. You can see here that Japan does not just go after Pearl Harbor and Hawaii. They take a number of actions in the Pacific that are going to be detrimental to the United States being able to put up a defense at the early stages of World War II for the U.S. So you can see here that the Axis powers are very dominant prior to the tide turning. So Britain, the United States, came to the conclusion that Germany was by far the bigger threat to world civilization. That even though Japan had been very successful at dominating Asia and they had quickly taken control of the Pacific, Germany was really seen as the major evil of the world. And so Britain and the United States developed a plan for how they would focus first on the European theater and try to hold off the Japanese as long as they could until the European theater was taken control of. Then the focus would turn to the Pacific. So the European war is going to be the main focal point of the Allies at this point. So the first fighting for the Allies is not actually going to be in Europe. It's going to be in North Africa, which is where the front is located. So the British are going to push back the Germans in Egypt. And the main foe of the British is this guy, General Erwin Rommel. He is probably the most successful of the German commanders during World War II. He is also probably the least Nazi of the Nazi party. He was not really adherent to the doctrine of of Hitler and the Nazi belief, but he was a military guy and he went with what the German high command wanted. So the U.S. troops are going to be pushing into Tunisia, which is another area of North Africa. The most familiar names from the United States leadership are General Eisenhower, you have Patton, and Bradley that are going to eventually force Rommel to surrender in Tunisia. So this campaign takes almost a year. From 1942 in through 1943. So it's not like a very easy, decisive victory for the United States. This takes a lot of fighting. And from here, the next plan to invade Europe is actually to go through Italy. Italy, once again, was seen as the weaker of the two Axis powers in Europe. So, what was considered the weak underbelly of Europe was going to be the focal point of the Allied forces. So, from North Africa, they're going to first island hop to Sicily before eventually attacking the Italian peninsula. While this is happening, Mussolini is going to be overthrown. Germany is going to kind of take over control of Italy, essentially, where even though Mussolini has been removed from power by the Italian people, Germany is still going to put up the fight for control of Italy against the Allied forces. While this is going on, the Soviets are eventually able to push back the German forces. It takes many, many lives. Millions of people are going to die in this process. Turning back the Germans at Leningrad, Stalingrad, pushing them back through Eastern Europe. And you can see the picture there of Mussolini being hung in Milan after he was captured and overthrown. In the Pacific, you see that the Japanese are able to consolidate their power here, and you can see the first fighting attacks, the Battle of Midway from June 4 through 6, 1942. This is a turning point for the U.S. because we are able to push back the possible invasion of Midway. And from this point onward, America is going to slowly creep Japan back to its home island. So this was really kind of the biggest outstretching that all of Japan had during the course of World War II. You have the Desert Fox Erwin Rommel there. You have, for the British, General Bernard Montgomery. And then you have the campaign, the soft underbelly of Europe, the Italian campaign, first hopping to Sicily before moving slowly up the Italian peninsula. And again, this is going to be not an easy fight. Over a year of conflict from 1943 up through 1944 into 1945 actually is where it finally is liberated. So it's many and very intense fighting that takes place. There was always this call for opening up a second front in Western Europe. That while the Soviets are holding off the Germans, they keep clamoring for the Allies, the British, the Americans, to open up a Western front, similar to what happened in World War I, mainly because that was the only way to divert the resources of the German forces. With Germany not having to fight a second conflict on the Western Front, they were able to put all of their resources in the fight against the Russians, while Italy was trying to hold back the Americans in the Italian campaign. So they were desperate for opening up an attack through France on Western Europe. The plan that eventually comes to fruition after many years of planning, from 1942 up through 1944, you have Operation Overlord, the single largest campaign in American history, where you have 1 million fighting forces that are going to land on the shores of Normandy and in the interior through paratroopers. This Atlantic wall that the Germans had been able to build up was a very impressive fortification that really any attack on the mainland of France was going to be high casualties. So this Operation Overlord is lots of undertaking with all of the troops and the materials that were needed for this invasion on June 6th, 1944. The Allied troops are going to cross the English Channel, land in Normandy. They made sure to kind of give off the false impression that they were going to land about 30 miles down the beach. So the Germans put a lot of their concentration of forces about 30 miles away from Normandy. Even with the lack of resources available, the Germans put on quite a fight, and it was over 3 days before the beaches of Normandy were finally kind of overtaken by the Allied forces. Within 2 months, the Allies had retaken Paris, liberated France, and after 4 years of Nazi occupation, the French country is going to be once again liberated by the Allied forces. So all of France is going to be free by September of 1944. Now, I would love this. I would show there's a movie called Saving Private Ryan, and I'm sure you've heard of it before. It's a really wonderful look and very realistic interpretation for what happened at the D-Day invasion. D-Day is the D actually doesn't stand for anything specifically. You would think it's like Decision Day or Devastation Day. The D is just a code word. So that's kind of strange. I'm going to move on. So you have the D-Day invasion here, Operation Overlord, led by General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Here's a little bit more information. So coming from the English Channel is about 30 miles across. So it's not an easy pathway across, and especially with all the German forces that are waiting, any kind of large-scale mobilization is going to be very easily detected. So there was a lot of planning that was made to make sure that the Germans were thrown off on where the invasion was going to take place. You can see that this is not just an American invasion as well. You have the British, you have Canadian forces that are going to be involved in this invasion. There's good old Captain America. Within a couple months, you have the liberation of Paris. And we are quickly moving towards victory in Europe. From summer, fall time through 1945, probably the most brutal fighting that takes place in the war, the highest casualty rate is going to exist here. Germans are going to launch a counterattack against Allied forces, pushing them back, creating a massive bulge in the front lines. This is referred to as the Battle of the Bulge. It's the last-ditch effort by the Germans. They kind of threw everything that they had at the Americans, hoping for one last-ditch effort, kind of similar to what happened with Dunkirk at the very beginning of the war, hoping that a blitzkrieg situation would be once again able to overcome the Allies. This was a little bit too little too late at this point. The Americans, despite heavy casualties, will continue to push back this bulge. So what really kind of destroys the will of the German people is not so much the failure of the Battle of the Bulge, but while that's going on, American and British air forces were pummeling German cities, factories, day and night. These bombing raids that would took place for months over Germany kind of just destroyed the spirit of the German people. So while the Americans the British are pushing towards Germany from the west, you have the Soviets that are going to be also pushing from the east. So it's basically Germany is collapsing upon itself with kind of being surrounded. And then again, from the south, you have Italy falling apart. with the Allies also taking control of Italy. So really, Hitler by 1945 sees the writing on the wall that the German Empire is collapsing upon it. That he simply tried to outstretch himself and try to take on too many enemies all at once. Well, before the end of the war in April of 1945, when things look very close to being completed with forces outside the capital of Berlin in Germany, President Roosevelt is going to run and win a fourth term in office. At this point, though, he is pretty weak, from not mentally weak, physically weak, health wise weak. The 12 years of dealing with the Depression and now World War II have taken a toll on the president. After he had won his reelection in November of 1944, he went on vacation to Georgia for a little bit of time to recuperate from the stress of running through another campaign. Roosevelt's going to die about a month into his fourth term here in 1945, serving 12 years as president. No president has ever served more than 2 terms, let alone 4 terms. And there was actually a constitutional amendment after the death of Roosevelt to make sure that no other president would do that. Not that they felt that there would be another abuse of power or any abuse of power for that matter. It was simply they wanted to return to the 2-term limit that Washington had kind of established for the presidency. So with FDR passing away in April of 1945, you have Harry Truman that is going to be sworn in as president, taking over control. Now, like I said, the war is not over yet. You still have the lasting vestiges of the German army in that are slowly coming to an end, but you have the war in the Pacific that's still raging on. So Truman has a lot that he has to deal with when he becomes the president. British U.S. troops closing in on Berlin, Soviet troops advancing from the east. On April 25th, American and Soviet troops actually met outside of Berlin, about 60 miles south of Berlin. Their forces were able to meet up to combine, and the Allied planes were continuing to pummel Berlin with bombs. Hitler, again, seeing on the writing on the wall, 5 days later, on April 30th, is going to commit suicide in his underground bunker. Within a week, Germany is going to surrender, and May 8th is officially celebrated as Victory in Europe Day. And actually, if you go to Europe, probably not anytime soon, but if you were to travel to Europe, hopefully in the future, May 8th is still recognized today as a Victory Day. And you will see parades around Europe celebrating this victory. Like I said, Hitler is going to have an underground bunker in Berlin. He's going to commit suicide with his wife, Eva Braun. And that's where I'm going to leave you for today. Tomorrow, or whenever the last video comes out, we will look at the final section, which is looking at the war in the Pacific and how America is going to come to grips with the end of World War II and what the rest of the world needs to kind of figure out in the post-war economy, the post-war security, and these other apparatus. So thank you so much for listening. If you have any questions, let me know. I'll talk to you again soon. Thanks.